Guten Abend, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Susanne Keppler-Schlesinger, the director of the Austrian Cultural Forum New York, and it is with great pleasure that I welcome all of you tonight. We are going to honor the lives and the work of countless Austrian lawyers and trainee lawyers persecuted by the Nazi regime. This event is deeply embedded in what we call Gedenkkultur, culture of remembrance, an important mission and also duty of the Austrian diplomacy. Advokaten 1938 is not only an impressive and monumental publication, it also moves our hearts through its well-researched biographies, through portraits and family photos. Let me thank all guests on our podium for being here with us tonight. I would like to start and invite you to welcome with me the Austrian Consul General, Ms. Helene Steinhaeusl. The following guests have made a trip across the Atlantic to be here with us to present this publication, and I will start with Dr. Armenak Utudjian, President of the Chamber of Lawyers in Austria. Professor Magister Hanna Lessing, Secretary General of the Nationalfonds in Österreich, in Austria. Dr. Alex Frank Thomasa, attorney, founder of the law firm Alex Frank Thomasa. And I'm also very happy to welcome with you Professor Dr. Ilse Reiter-Zadlutak, I'd say the main motor behind this wonderful initiative. I would also like to thank the wonderful violinist Lena-Marie Stoger for having welcomed us with the first part of Johann Sebastian Bach's Sonata No. 3, allowing us to move our thoughts a little bit away from our daily work and to commemorate the 1,900 lawyers who have suffered unbearable injustice, and many of them were also murdered. Ladies and gentlemen, after the presentation, there will be time for questions and answers, and after that, I cordially invite all of you to join us at the reception. There's also a possibility to purchase this volume, so please watch out for Miss Miriam. Where is she? That's the young lady. She will take care of selling the books to all who are interested. And I now give the floor, or rather the screen, to the Austrian Minister of Justice, Alma Zadić, who graciously agreed to address us with a video message. Thank you, and I wish all of you a wonderful evening.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to welcome you via video message to the book presentation Advokaten 1938 at the Austrian Cultural Forum in New York City. This book documents the history of 2,200 lawyers and trainee lawyers who were barred from continuing their formation or from practicing their legal profession in Austria. This book documents a part of our history that should never be forgotten. Therefore, it is all the more gratifying that the book's second edition is available in English, making it more accessible to a broader audience. Taking a firm stand against anti-Semitism is a collective responsibility. Jewish individuals continue to face discrimination, hatred, and harassment, emphasizing the need for us to prevent history from repeating itself. To fulfill our historical responsibility, we must reflect on and understand our past. Lessons can only be learned from history if we are aware of it. Effective prevention requires research, political education, and enlightenment to successfully support an open and democratic society. Active remembrance requires dialogue, interaction, and reflection. With this book and its presentation, you are actively participating in this process. All of you attending this event today contribute to the collective effort by remembering the fate of the 2,200 lawyers and trainee lawyers. I thank you for your participation and attendance and wish you an informative event.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as the Austrian Consul General in New York, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you here at the premises of the Austrian Cultural Forum, where the second edition of the book Advokaten 1938 is being presented today. When in March 1938 the so-called Anschluss took place, Austria became part of the Third Reich, and the darkest chapter of Austrian history began. After World War II, Austria looked away for too long. Only belatedly did we come to terms with our role as perpetrators of the crimes that took place during these years and assumed the historical responsibility that comes with it. Many steps and initiatives have been taken since in order to ensure that we never forget what had happened in these dark days and to ensure that such terror and injustice will never repeat itself. Remembering the fate of the lawyers and trainees registered with the Austrian Regional Bar Associations, who were stripped of their occupation and banned from practicing their legal profession between the years 1938 to 45, represents just one, but a very important part of this culture of remembrance, as Susanne has already called it, that Austria has been trying to live for many years now. The book Advokaten 1938, in its second edition, constitutes a comprehensive compendium that serves as a memorial book as well as a critical analysis. It is an essential contribution to the ensuring that the past is not forgotten and that future generations know about the horrible events that took place during the Third Reich. This is all the more relevant today as anti-Semitism is on the rise all around the globe, unfortunately. Let me just briefly mention another measure taken by Austria to assume responsibility, namely the amendment of the Austrian citizenship law. It now offers a simplified procedure for the descendants of the victims of the Nazi regime to reclaim Austrian citizenship. As of today, more than 25,000 persons have already regained Austrian citizenship all over the world, and we are pleased to notice that there is a continuous interest also here in New York. When my team and I were browsing through the book, Advokaten 1938, we discovered with interest that several of the declarations to reclaim Austrian citizenship that we received at the Consulate in fact came from persons who are children or grandchildren of lawyers recorded in that book. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you once more for being here with us tonight. Thank you for your interest and also for your support in our collective duty to make sure that the crimes of the Nazi regime are not forgotten and that we hold true to our promise, never again. Thank you very much.
Here we are, in the boardroom of the Vienna Bar Organization, facing the gallery of past presidents of the Vienna Bar who were involved in many important decisions of the liberal profession of lawyers since 1868, including one past president who was involved in the decisions around March 1938, which deprived many of our lawyer and trainee lawyer colleagues of their license to work as a lawyer or trainee lawyer. I am Dr. Alex Frank-Thomaser, a lawyer registered with the Vienna Bar and chairperson of the Association of Research of the Professional History of the Members of the Austrian Bar Discredited Between 1938 and 1945, which is the editor of the book Advokaten 1938, and its second edition I would like to introduce to you. The first edition of the book Advokaten 1938 was published in November 2010 and dealt with the fates of 1,913 lawyers registered with the Regional Bar Organizations of Austria on January 1, 1938, who were altogether barred from practicing the legal profession from 1938 to 1945. The first edition was published in German. The second edition of Advokaten 1938, for the first time, contains not only the biographies of lawyers, but also of the many trainee lawyers who were deprived of their livelihoods or whose lives were eradicated. And it also speaks about the lives and the work of others who either returned to Austria and resumed practicing the legal profession, or those who were able to acquire a qualification to practice the same or a similar profession abroad. Obviously, it is easier to deal with an anonymous group of people who were deprived of their rights than to be confronted with the personal fates of specific individuals. With the inclusion of the fates of affected trainee lawyers, the legal profession in Austria has now engaged in dealing with this comprehensive task. The second edition of Advokaten 1938 deliberately focuses on the personal fate of every single lawyer and trainee lawyer who was persecuted. The academic contributions of the authors Professor Dr. Ilse Reiter-Zadlockal, Vienna Faculty of Law, and historian Dr. Barbara Sauer in this second edition of Advokaten 1938 present their recent research findings and thus provide new insights. This second edition of Advokaten 1938 is published solely in English, so as to allow relatives and friends and all others around the globe who wish to preserve the memory of the victims to understand their fates and the history behind each and every individual. By means of this book, we would like to remember the fates of 2,200 Austrian lawyers and trainee lawyers who experienced the most horrible things under the Nazi regime in Austria. A remembrance that is not only dedicated to dealing with the immensely negative aspects of recent Austrian history, but that is meant to keep the memory of these Austrian lawyers and trainee lawyers alive. Anti-Semitism in Austria did not start just in March 1938. In the so-called long 19th century, anti-Semitism in Austria was visible in all areas of society. At the law faculty of the University of Vienna, the proportion of Jewish students was about 11% in 1864. It subsequently rose to nearly 21% in 1894, once a reform of 1872 allowed Jews not only to obtain the Doctor Juris Civilis degree, but also to be awarded that of Doctor Utriusque Juris, doctor of both laws, civil and canon. This anti-Semitic newspaper cartoon, published in 1894 in the paper Kikeriki, reflects the rise of the figures of Jewish students at the Vienna University and strongly underlines its anti-Semitic impact with the words, "The university once and now. This is how it was, and this is how it is." Anti-Semitism was present across the Austrian party political spectrum in the interwar period, ranging widely between the open anti-Semitism of the Greater Germans and Christian socialists and anti-Semitic attitudes in the Social Democratic Workers' Party. The election poster for the Christian Social Party of 1920 declares an open anti-Semitic propaganda. The identical anti-Semitic propaganda is, as you can see, not only verbally expressed in this election poster by the words, "Read, pass it on, German comrades, these are your present leaders, the leaders of international social democracy. Do you want others? Then vote German Christian and give no voice to Judaized international social democracy." The Aryan paragraph of 1919 aimed at excluding Jews entirely from many areas of life, while the demand for a numerus clausus proportionalis aimed to restrict their number across all academic professions to a proportion corresponding to the percentage of the total population. Riots against Jewish and social democratic students increased in the First Republic. When the National Socialist German Student Union, established in Vienna in 1926, became the strongest fraction in the German Student Union, the spiral of violence accelerated. In 1933, as you can see, Jewish students had even to be evacuated from the first Anatomy Institute from violent gangs of Nazi thugs. In view of this climate, it is hardly surprising that one of the most influential Viennese professors of Jewish origin accepted an appointment in Cologne in 1930, Hans Kelsen. Hans Kelsen is considered the architect of the Austrian Federal Constitution of 1920. In 1936, even the following absurd proposal was made. 1,000 Jewish lawyers give up their offices to Aryans, and in exchange 1,000 Aryans will be replaced by 1,000 Jews as street sweepers, canal cleaners, bricklayers, and the like, because full equality means nothing other than a full numerus clausus. In 1932, the Zionist Siegfried Cantor became president of the Vienna Bar Association. He was also president of the Union Internationale des Avocats, the oldest world association of lawyers. However, anti-Semites considered Cantor's election a provocation, and it was intolerable to many non-Jewish members of the chamber in view of the strengthening of National Socialism. In 1932, about 150 Zionist lawyers belonged to the Association of Jewish Lawyers in Vienna, an association who took stand against the various attacks on Jewish lawyers. Siegfried Cantor was a member, and until 1938, it was one of the strongest Viennese lawyers' clubs. Within short delay after March 1938, many of our lawyer colleagues were deprived from their licenses to practice law based on the decree on matters relating to lawyers, defense attorneys and notaries, and patent attorneys in Austria of 31st of March 1938. Dr. Norbert Babbert was one of them, being deprived of his license to practice as a lawyer. Born in 1886 in Austrian Silesia, Lipnik nad Bečou, in today's Czech Republic, obtained his doctorate of law in Vienna in 1913 and was admitted to the bar in 1921. He practiced in his law office in Vienna's first district until around September 1938, when he was forced to emigrate to Czechoslovakia. He fled to his sister Clara Babbert-Buxbaum, residing in Ostrava. Norbert was rounded up and put on a train for Auschwitz. Somehow, he escaped and made his way back to Ostrava. Later, he was sent to Terezin, Theresienstadt, where he remained until the end of the war, and then returned to Ostrava to live there until his death in 1958. His sister, Clara Buchsbaum, was murdered in a gas chamber at Auschwitz. Our trainee lawyers. In 1928, newspapers reported about the youngest female lawyer trainee, Fräulein Dr. Susanne Zadić, had been appointed as a trainee in one of the best-known Viennese law firms after completing her one-year compulsory court clerkship. Zadić made her debut as a defense lawyer in August 1928 at the criminal court as a public defender of a homeless Slovak woman accused of theft. As reported in the press, in the course of the last few years, only 2 female defense lawyers have appeared at public hearings, although there were already a number of female law graduates. Zadić was therefore one of the first 3 women who had already represented the law in court in Vienna. In August 1928, one of the Viennese newspapers emphasized that Zadić neither wore horn-rimmed glasses, nor was blessed with venerable grey hair, neither smoked cigars, nor dressed in unfashionable garments, but was rather a young and pretty lady. She was, in a word, the well-known young sportswoman, Susanne Zadić, an award-winning Austrian fencer, excellent skier, and trained swimmer. Zadić justified her career choice as follows. I was already born to be a defender. My grandfather was a lawyer. My father is a lawyer. Nothing was more natural than to take up the same profession. It's a hereditary predisposition. I couldn't imagine being anything else. Zadić was forced to emigrate shortly after the Anschluss in May 1939. Her license to practice as a lawyer and granted to her earlier was deleted based on her so-called waiver. Probably she and her husband already left in February 1938, stayed shortly in Paris, sailed from Cherbourg to the USA, arrived in New York a year later in February 1939, and first lived in New York City and then moved to Seattle, Washington. In 1944, she obtained the US citizenship. She never worked again in her beloved profession. These 2 examples of individual fates cannot give more than a scarce example of the tragedies of 2,200 Austrian lawyers and trainee lawyers, which are published in this 2nd edition of the book Advokaten 1938. The book Advokaten 1938 should be an enduring warning of how quickly justice can become injustice if, as in the years from 1938 to 1945, and even before that, legal professionals, lawyers, public prosecutors, judges, and judicial officers, and ultimately even an entire parliament, as the legislator, let themselves become the instruments of a dictatorship.
General Helene Steinhaeusl. I hope the mic is working. Thank you. Director Dr. Susanne Keppler-Schlesinger. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm now the 5th welcoming remark in this evening. So maybe I will repeat something you already heard, but it needs to be emphasized. Therefore, it was a big responsibility for me as representative of the Austrian Bar Association of 7,000 Austrian lawyers and 2,200 trainee lawyers to come here to New York City to this very important book presentation. As you already heard, in the years 1938 till 1945, Austria has lived through the darkest hours and days and months and years of its history. The majority of Austrian lawyers had to be disbarred. As you mentioned, justice became injustice. Had to be disbarred for racist or other reasons, and lost their professional basis, and many of them were murdered by an inhumane and cruel and criminal Nazi regime. To put it into a perspective, today, as I mentioned, we have 7,000 Austrian lawyers. At that time, 2,200 were disbarred and discredited. And in the end of 1938, only 700 lawyers were registered with the regional bars in Austria. It has been a very big duty and responsibility to research not only the history of the victims and their fates, but also as well the contribution of the bar officers at that time, as we heard in the video message by Alex Frank Thomaser. This book, which is now published in its second edition, is dedicated to the memory of those victims. It shall help to preserve and commemorate the historical facts, the horrible fate for the future in order not to forget. Due to this very important reason, the Austrian Bar is very thankful for the recent second edition, which now also includes, as we heard, the trainee lawyers and their similar fate in 1938 and in the following years. This book's second edition has been published in English language, thus addressing it especially to many relatives, families of the victims living abroad, which is also very important to give the memory to them. This publication would not have been possible without the strong engagement of one person. This is Dr. Alex Frank Thomaser. She worked many years on this project, endless and tireless hours devoted to this project, and without your very enduring work, this would not have been possible. Therefore, a round of applause for Alex Frank Thomaser. I would also like to thank the director of the Austrian Cultural Forum here in New York for giving us this floor and in this landmark building in New York to present the second edition of this very important book, Advokaten 1938. And we also thank the Consul General Helene Steinhaeusl for her support in this project. Thanks for giving me the floor to talk to you on behalf of the Austrian lawyers. I convey their best greetings and wishes for all of you here in New York. Thank you for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, as you may know, in addition to our central mission at the National Fund of supporting survivors, we also promote learning from history. I would like to outline in a few words why the National Fund considers this project to be so worthy of support, and why supporting this big book has also a very personal importance to me. With our project funding, we want to reach as many people as possible at all levels of society. This is why we like to support initiatives coming to terms with the past in all areas of life, be it regional projects or projects with a special focus, like in this case, the legal profession. This is because, especially after the Anschluss, Nazi ideology permeated every aspect of Austrian society and shaped the country as a whole. The after effects can still be felt today. Anti-Semitic patterns of thought passed down through the generations are still deeply entrenched and remain implanted in many people's minds, often deeply buried in the subconscious. Time and again, these prejudices break through to the surface. In times of crisis, when people are trying to find explanations for things that are hard to understand, when they need scapegoats. We have seen this very clearly at late. We just need to think of the pandemic or the war in Ukraine, and most recently, the terrible events of October 7th in Israel that shocked the world, unfortunately only for a short period, when Hamas terrorists massacred 1,200 Jews in Israel and are still holding 130 Israelis hostages. Today, 7th of March, marks 5 months since their abduction. Bring them home now. Sorry to be so personal. Conspiracy theories and intolerance of all kinds are giving rise to the most fantastical ideas and attitudes. When reason sleeps, the old demons begin to stir. This book can serve as a reminder to the legal profession today. It reminds us of the responsibility that, in my opinion, is particularly incumbent upon lawyers. Because the deprivation of rights on such a grand scale took place under the guise of law, it was legitimized by law. Lawyers especially must have recognized more clearly than many others the injustice that was being enshrined and perpetrated. In this respect, this book, which objectively documents the massive consequences this had on the individual fates of the lawyers affected, can set in motion valuable processes of reflection on developments in the present. From almost 29 years at the National Fund, in which we have spoken to thousands of displaced persons, of survivors, we also know how important projects like this are for the survivors and their descendants. I also know this from my own family. My grandmother, Margit Lessing, and her mother were among those murdered in the camps. My father, Eric Lessing, escaped. My great-uncle, Paul Lessing, also had to flee Austria in 1938. He arrived in Palestine in October 1938. You will find his name in this book, because Paul Lessing was one of the hundreds of lawyers who were persecuted and disenfranchised after the Anschluss. He had his practice in the 1st District of Vienna, near the Votiv Church, in Maria Therese Straße. What an irony of fate that our offices, at the time also of the National Fund, were exactly around the corner of his office. Paul Lessing's fate is representative of the fate of many of his peers, as we have learned time and again at the National Fund. For people whose professional existence was so closely linked to the German language, and also in the case of the lawyers, also to Austrian legal system, exile was a particular challenge. A huge rupture in their professional biography, almost a loss of identity. As a rule, they were not able to pursue professions nearly as qualified in their countries of exile, and often had to keep their heads above water with unskilled jobs. Paul Lessing, my uncle, had no income until 1943. He was dependent on his wife, Betty, who earned her living as a knitter. I remember the similar case of a lawyer who picked oranges in exile and was never able to work again as a lawyer. Like my father, Paul returned to Vienna after the war. From 1949 onwards, he dedicated his legal practice to restitution and compensation. This is where our biographies intersect, the endeavor to achieve some kind of historical justice, some form of reparation, which is of course not possible, connects me with him. History sometimes has a very personal significance. The second expanded edition on Advokaten 1938 is being presented today. It shows the survivors and their descendants that their fate has not been forgotten. In this respect, I think it is wonderful that the book is being published in English and will thus reach many of those who did not return to Austria. In this context, I would like to mention another project, which, like the book being presented, deals with another key professional group. I have the honor of being a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the project 1938 to 1945 and after, members of the Austrian Foreign Service. This is a research project in which one of the authors of the book presented today, Barbara Sauer, is also involved. The project shows how consciously and proactively the Austrian Federal Ministry of European and international affairs is now coming to terms with its past. Why is this so important to me? Because when state institutions and key professions critically address dark aspects of their past, it sets an example and sparks awareness. I consider this role model effect to be a particular value for a society's ability and willingness to learn. Projects such as these are also memorial projects, it was mentioned, building a bridge to a lost world. A survivor once told me, "Don't just remember how we died, remember how we lived." Advokaten 1938 is a place of remembrance, a lieu de mémoire that protects an important part of Austria from being forgotten. Thank you.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. First of all, I may, on behalf of the Association of Research of the Professional History of the members of the Austrian Bar, discredited between 1938 and 1945, and on behalf of all the Austrian lawyers, very warmly thank our host, Director of the Cultural Forum, Mrs. Dr. Susanne Keppler-Schlesinger, and her team for the wonderful assistance and cooperation preparing today's event. To start my accompanying words as the representative of the editor of the book, I would like to read to you a letter written by a German lawyer to the Saxony Ministry of Justice in Dresden in May 1933. You will not find this letter or the fate of this lawyer in the book Advokaten 1938, as Dr. Helmut Klemperer was a German lawyer and a member of the Chemnitz Bar from 1925 and not a registered lawyer with one of the Austrian Bar Associations. However, this letter reflects what a persecuted Austrian lawyer who usually stood for the law and had been deprived of the law and of his or her representation rights may have felt as a result of the despaired stamp. This is this stamp you see on the book, in their legal record, which you can see on this book. Dresden, May 13, 1933. I received your letter dated May 4, 1993, in which you informed me that you are considering revoking my admission to the legal profession as I am not of Aryan heritage. In this regard, I state as follows. It is correct that I am not of Aryan heritage. I am far happier to boast that I am of Jewish heritage, as were Jesus Christ and Karl Marx, the greatest advocates for the rights of those who toil and bear heavy loads, the downtrodden and exploited classes. It is not that I am proud of this heritage, for I have not earned it on my own merit. Racial pride is absurd. But I am pleased to belong to the Jewish community. It stood on the highest step of civilized behavior while the Aryan peoples of Europe were still wild savages. They have persecuted and derided this community for centuries, but its written history and its laws have made their mark on the culture of the Western world forever. I also take great pleasure in my kinship with those many great men of more recent times to whom the German legal profession, in fact the entire German administration of justice and legal studies, owes so much. With the first Reich Court President von Simpson, with Staub, Pinner, Bondi, Wilmotsky, Levy, Stein, Jonas, Goldscheid, Hachenburg, Isai, Seligsohn, Finger, Fuchs, Löwe, Rosenberg, Glaser, Rosenfeld, Manasse, Friedländer, Dernburg, Jelinek, Dix, Mamrot, Marcuse, Nussbaum, Brinksheim, Höninger, Kelsen, Naviasny, Lenel, Abraham, Leon, Sinsheimer, Strupp, Drucker, Levi, Alsberg, Beit, Magnus, and the many teachers and masters, German law, who make no fuss about their Jewish heritage. I have no objection to you excluding me from the German legal profession. I will be in such excellent company that I will have trouble showing myself worthy of it. It is true that until now I took pride in being a German lawyer. Today, however, I take pride in not being one. For the greatest assets of our nation lie in ruins. The independence and objectivity of the administration of justice, the respect for the opinions of those who think differently for their lives, their freedom, and their property no longer exists in Germany. Thousands are rotting in Germans' prisons without due process, without trials, for no other crime than they do not share the prevailing opinion. The suicides of these innocents speak a terrible language, terrible for Germany. Germany no longer follows the rule of law, and no exalted German judge, no eminent German lawyer of Aryan heritage has the Germanic courage to stand openly against this as counsel for the trampled rights of the minority, to say publicly what most of them think privately. That is why I rejoice in this line that you have drawn. However absurd your theories may, which a German Jew may no longer be a lawyer. I would laugh about it, the way the entire world is laughing, if I weren't close to crying, not for myself, nor for the German Jews, nor for the victims of the new system, but rather crying for Germany, for my country, which has struck itself from the ranks of the civilized nations. Exclude us from the legal profession. It will not stop us fighting for the law. This is our profession, just as German is our culture and Judaism is our heritage. You can't take that away from us. Governments come and go, but we will not tire, and more will follow us. One day the German people will realize that they went down the wrong path. Once again, one day they will turn from the mad rush of feasts and festivals back to reason and objectivity, from Gleichschaltung, consolidation, to equal rights for all. And we will bring about this day, mark my words, Germany awake. Signed, Helmut Klemperer. Let me tell you some words about the development of the book Advokaten 1938. This was definitely not always a welcome publication project. There were times when I, as an editor, had the duty to ask for the opening of Austrian archives for our researcher and co-author Dr. Barbara Sauer, who cannot be with us tonight. It was not only once that my initial request was rejected and successful only at a second or even later attempt. One of these archives responded to my request to open its doors to our researcher. We never had Jews in our city. It took me a night to reconsider whether I should rather impolitely and harshly insist on my request or elegantly deposit my request again. I decided for the elegance and sent a very detailed historical city map indicating the various synagogues by claiming the city archives management's response might be a mere historical error. Thereafter, this archive was opened for our researcher within hours. On the other hand, we had many influential persons assisting this publication project financially as well as otherwise, and not to forget the many family history researchers throughout the world that reacted to our website www.advokaten1938.com, online since February 2007, and sending us till today many bits and pieces of the history of the former Austrian lawyers and trainee lawyers in their families. Without them, this book could not have become such a complete picture of the fates of the persecuted lawyers and trainee lawyers. In times of today, When many lawyers worldwide, in China, in Russia, in Turkey, in Poland, and in many other countries, are again under political pressure when defending democracy and the rule of law, a publication like Advokaten 1938 wins for us a new significance. We, as the editor, wish to encourage many, many similar publications, not only to commemorate, but also to open the eyes to unlawful and anti-democratic thinking and acting. Let me finally drop some words on the occasion of tomorrow's World Women's Day 2024. The book Advokaten 1938 contains also the history of the pioneers of the Austrian women, registered as lawyers with the Austrian Regional Bars. The New Yorker lawyer and president of the International Federation of Business and Professional Women, Mrs. Lena-Marie Phillips, met with one of these Austrian pioneer women lawyers, Marianne Beeth, herself the first Austrian female lawyer, on the occasion of the International Convention of the Federation in Vienna in July 1931, a convention whose members discussed the working conditions of women worldwide then. Marianne Beeth was forced into exile and arrived in New York in January 1939. She obtained later the US citizenship and never worked as a lawyer again, and lived and died in the United States. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for me to be here today and to present our book, Advokaten 1938. I also would like to start with the bare figures to show again the massive bloodletting that the Austrian bar suffered. At the time of Austria's annexation to Nazi Germany, the Austrian Bar Associations had more than 2,600 members. By the end of 1938, only 771. 1,805 persecuted lawyers were removed from the rolls of the Bar Association in Vienna during the Nazi period. The majority of them were removed at the end of 1938 because they were classified as Jews under the Nuremberg race law. Another 108 lawyers were struck from the rolls of the other Austrian bar associations. Among those struck from the rolls were 20 of the only 25 female lawyers in Austria, for example, Marianne Beeth. The number of the trainee lawyers affected was 250, including 34 female trainee lawyers. Most of these professional bans were also based on the classification of those affected as Jews under the Nazi racial law. Of course, the anti-Semitism that manifested itself in these professional bans did not erupt in Austria only in 1938, but was already a powerful phenomenon in the period prior to that. This also and especially affected the Austrian Bar Associations, which had a high proportion of Jews and people of Jewish origin. Although the Jewish population in the Austrian part of the Habsburg monarchy was less than 5% at the turn of the century, and just under 13 in Vienna, Jewish law students in Vienna accounted for about 1/5 of the total at the turn of the century. But for a long time, however, law graduates of Jewish origin had only limited career opportunities after graduation. The basic equality of the Jewish population, which had already been enshrined in the Constitution of 1867, was limited by the fact that a legal career in civil service was practically impossible without conversion to the Christian faith, especially since Christian socialists and German nationalists gained influence after the liberal era.
For those Jews who didn't want to take the step of accepting the Christian faith, the only option available to them was to become lawyers. Thus, already in 1893, almost 58% of the 681 lawyers and 86% of the 360 trainee lawyers were Jewish, which is why this book also deals with the legal profession before 1938. In the period following the collapse of the monarchy, anti-Semitism reached a particular intensity. It was now primarily directed against the so-called Eastern Jews who had fled in large numbers from the Tsarist troops during the First World War. At this time of the First Republic, the Vienna law faculty was also characterized by radical anti-Semitism of racial nature, which was felt both by students and professors of Jewish origin. Bruno Kreisky, later Austrian Chancellor in the 1970s, who studied law in Vienna from 1939, recalled, quote, "It was simply hell. Students who were known to be of Jewish descent or looked like Jewish were repeatedly violently beaten out of the universities." The number of Jews in the Bar Association also remained high. Even during the Austro-Fascist era, it was over 60%. Of course, this high percentage was mainly due to the fact that the various state and municipal offices were closed to them. But it was not only the high proportion of Jews among the lawyers that the anti-Semitic groups criticized. They also complained that the bar associations had been infiltrated by Eastern Jews to an intolerable degree. Anti-Semitic parties and associations became increasingly aggressive in demanding a numerous clauses for Jews in the bar. We already have heard about that. These numerous clauses demands were, of course, also fueled by the massive economic hardship of the lawyers, which is also described in detail in the book, particularly affected by the so-called overcrowding and proletarianization of the legal profession, which was much deplored in the First Republic and during the Austro-Fascistic era, where, of course, the trainee lawyers, who were often paid little or nothing at all, were especially affected. Of course, it was particularly difficult for women who did not have a lawyer in the family to find a trainee position in a law office, as well as for the so-called Eastern Jews. Incidentally, many of the relevant advertisements for trainee lawyers even explicitly mentioned being Christian or Aryan as a requirement for employment. Given these developments in the First Republic and during the Austro-Fascist era, it is hardly surprising that the so-called de-Jewification of the legal profession took place at a rapid pace after the so-called Anschluss. The first bans on Jewish lawyers were issued on the very day German troops invaded Austria, albeit initially without any legal basis. In Carinthia, for example, the Villach lawyer Marcel Glasinger was informed as early as 12th of March as follows, quote, "The Corinthian Bar Association hereby prohibits you from practicing your profession until further notice. Any violation of this prohibition will result in the immediate imposition of Schutzhaft, protective custody." On March the 14th, the admission of Jews, or so-called half-Jews, to the legal profession was blocked. Oath-taking ceremonies that had already been scheduled had to be cancelled. At the same time, physical assaults and robberies against Jewish lawyers became commonplace. The Viennese lawyer Salomon Rappaport reported after the end of the Nazi regime, quote, "Shortly after the Nazis marched in, I was called out twice to clean up the streets. But apart from being verbally abused and doused with cold water, I suffered no further damage. But shortly afterwards, however, he had to report to the SS to be assigned to work, and he continues his account, quote, I was given the task of cleaning a room, and right at the beginning I burned my hands with a lye that was in the bucket. And finally an NS man gave him a blow to the face, so, quote, that I immediately fell to the ground as the blood poured over me. He had knocked out 3 upper teeth, and I was bleeding from my nose and face. The scar remains to this day. Another Viennese lawyer, Lorenz Massino, wrote after the end of the Nazi regime, quote, I was born and raised in Vienna. For 24 years I practiced my profession there as a lawyer. It is my pride that I mention that for 15 years I was elected councillor for the municipality in Vienna. Then, however, on March 16th, my Austrian friends suddenly appeared in my apartment wearing brown shirts and SR uniforms, confiscated all my savings and any object in my apartment of any value whatsoever, then dragged them to a lorry which had also been provided by one of my friends. I then spent 1 year in Dachau and Buchenwald. The first transport to Dachau took place on the 1st of April 1938. This was the so-called YEP transport, which also included lawyers such as Desider Friedmann and Jakob Ehrlich, president and vice president of the Jewish community before the Anschluss. At the end of March 1938, the Austrian Minister of Justice was then authorized to provisionally prohibit Jews and Jewish Mischlings from practicing as lawyers, although there were various exceptions, such as frontline service in the First World War. On the basis of this first decree, by the end of June 1938, 726 lawyers identified as Jews had been struck off the rolls. In order to protect the parties represented by these lawyers from legal disadvantage, the dismissed lawyers remained entitled and obliged to practice their profession for 3 weeks, as long as this was necessary for the protection of the parties. During this period, the parties had the opportunity to find another legal representative. The so-called final solution of the Jewish problem in the bar, in Nazi jargon, came with the 5th ordinance to the Reich Citizenship Act of September 1938. Jews were now banned from practicing law throughout the whole German Reich. By the end of December 1938, they were to be struck off the lawyers' rolls by order of the Reichsminister of Justice. Paul Deutsch wrote in the late 1970s, quote, I was a lawyer in Vienna. Since I had fought in the First World War, I retained my position as a lawyer in 1938. And it was only on December 31 that I received a scrap of paper, I cannot describe it otherwise, according to which I had been struck off the lawyers' rolls. Because so many lawyers were struck off these rolls, the Bar Association in Vienna even had a special stamp for these cases. The stamp is reproduced on the cover of the book. However, many lawyers did not wait to be struck off the rolls, but voluntarily gave up the practice of law in the course of 1938, or died, often by suicide. At the end of 1938, the Nazi newspaper, Der Stürmer, was able to report triumphantly, no more Jewish lawyers. In order to ensure that the Jewish population had access to legal advice and representation, Jewish counselors, so-called Consulenten, could be licensed where necessary. In the selection process, preference was again given to those who had fought in the First World War. However, being accepted as a Jewish consulate was no guarantee of survival. 55 of the 144 identified Consulenten died in the Shoah. Another decree, also issued in September 1938, ordered that Mischlings should be struck off the trainee lawyers' rolls. This did not include, again, frontline fighters and Mischlings whose families had lived in Austria for at least 50 years, Again, this was directed against the so-called Ostjuden who had moved from the western parts of Austria during the First World War. All these provisions also applied to Jewish trainee lawyers. However, it was much more difficult to trace the professional bans in these cases because there was no extra stamp for the trainee lawyers, and the corresponding handwritten notes in the rolls, such as the insertion of a J, were not regularly made. After these remarks on the legal background, I would now like to turn to the lives of the lawyers and trainee lawyers affected by the professional bans, which Barbara Sauer has researched in great detail for our book. Barbara's research revealed that 58 of the lawyers persecuted by the Nazis were able to leave the country. However, of these 1,127 lawyers, at least 78 were deported from their countries of exile to death camps. The percentage of refugees among trainee lawyers is even higher. At least 79% were able to leave Austria. Of course, at that time, leaving the country was still possible, and in many cases was directly enforced. The Viennese lawyer Hermann Ebner recounted this experience in 1956 as follows, quote, "I was repeatedly summoned by the Gestapo, where it was forcefully suggested to me that I emigrate or otherwise be sent to a concentration camp. I was also forbidden to continue practicing law, so I emigrated to Palestine, where I found myself in difficulties for a long time to come." The most important host country for lawyers fleeing abroad was the United States, to which 519 fled, followed by the United Kingdom with 176, Palestine with 129, and France with 90. However, many refugees were deported from their exile countries, mostly to Auschwitz, and murdered there, especially refugees in France. The distribution of the trainee lawyers among the countries of exiles is similar, but I will refrain from giving figures here. Although fleeing saved their lives in most cases, most refugees fared very poorly in their countries of exile, at least economically and financially. They usually had to completely reorient themselves professionally, as their legal qualifications were not recognized abroad. To prepare himself for such a new start, the Viennese lawyer Franz Josef Fischer, for example, learned to boil soap before leaving the country. In fact, a successful escape usually meant the complete economic destruction of the refugees' livelihoods. The Viennese lawyer Gustav Leipen, for example, wrote, quote, "Before my emigration from Austria in 1938, I practiced law in Vienna since 1898. I have always unselfishly placed my work and my abilities at the disposal of my colleagues and the Bar Association, and was a member of the Disciplinary Council of the Bar Association. From 1929, I held the office of Vice President. My present financial situation is very bad. As a result of the Nazi seizure of power and the resulting need to emigrate from Austria, I lost most of my assets. I have long since used the small remainder to pay for my and my wife's stay in America, where the cost of living is very high. I have been dependent on the support of friends and acquaintances for a long time now. Only a few of the lawyers and none of the 20 expelled women lawyers were able to continue practicing law in exile, as this would usually have meant going back to law school. Stefan Jaraj wrote in 1957, "In 1937, I was admitted to the Bar Association in Vienna. The National Socialist persecution forced me to emigrate from Austria in 1938, and I was subsequently struck from the roll of lawyers. I arrived in Australia as a refugee, penniless and with no training in other profession. I have made my living as a door-to-door salesman and factory worker, and I'm currently a low-level clerk with a salary that does not allow me to put anything aside for old age. My job offers no security for future, as I can be fired at any time and have no right to a pension. Many refugees had also suffered massive health problems as a result of arrest, mistreatment, and stays in concentration camps, making it difficult or impossible for them to return to work. Rudolf Lucan, for example, wrote of his first years in exile in Santiago de Chile that as a result of his stay in Buchenwald, he not only suffered from a double-sided hernia, but that for almost 2 years he was plagued by crying fits that often broke out with any external cause. His memory also suffered, quote, to such an extent that I could not retain nothing. In Austria, I was in full health, running my successful law practice to the certification of all. Because of the suffering in Buchenwald, I could not work in the public office or as a salesman. For if I forced myself to enter a shop, I would begin to cry and leave the shop as quick as possible instead of offering my goods. I would also not have been able to carry a suitcase full of samples. Those who did find jobs often worked in accounting, auditing, tax consulting, insurance, translation, import, export, or, as often was the case with women, in social work. Given these bleak employment prospects, it is not surprising that after the end of the Nazi regime, 244 lawyers and 22 trainees returned to Austria to practice law again in Austria. Those who were able to survive in Austria were, on the one hand, those who had been either forbidden to work as Mischlings or for political reasons and earned their living with various other jobs, such as office manager in a law firm, insurance clerk, real estate agents, and so on. On the other hand, those who lived as so-called full Jews in mixed marriages were also able to survive. They could either work as Consulenten or were used to forced labor or were dependent on their spouses for livelihood. Only a few were able to survive in hiding as so-called U-Boote submarines. For example, the trainee lawyer Fanny Schepedin, quote, During this time I stayed with Mrs. Marie Rieberer in Vienna. The apartment consisted of a kitchen with a window onto the corridor and an LA cabinet. The size of the entire apartment was about 16 to 18 square meters. There was only a bed bench in the closet for Mrs. Rieberer. I and my sister Paula, who was also in hiding, had to sleep on the floor on blankets because there was no room to put up another bed. We were also not allowed to go to the air raid shelter during bombing raids, but had to stay in the apartment. The agony and fear that I and my sister had to go through on such occasions cannot be put into words. But not all lawyers and trainee lawyers managed to escape or survive in the country. 398 former Austrian lawyers were deported from 1939 onwards, and only 16 survived these deportations, including only 8 who had been persecuted as Jews. 16 trainee lawyers were also deported and murdered. The aim of the first edition of the book Advokaten 1938 was to bring the lawyers persecuted by the Nazis out of the darkness of oblivion and into the light of a dignified memory. We wanted to give back as much of their individual history as possible to all the members of the bar associations who were persecuted by the Nazis, and now in the second edition also to all trainee lawyers. With the publication of the second edition in English, it is now possible to present the results of our research to an international audience. This will not only make it easier for the descendants of those persecuted by the Nazis to read the book, but may also provide new impulses for research work, especially in the former countries of exile. As authors, Barbara and me would like to thank all those who made this book possible through their financial support, especially the National Fund of the Republic of Austria for the Victims of the National Socialism, and the Anniversary Fund of the Austrian National Bank. Our translators, Joanna White and Kirsty Jane Falconer, have also made a major contribution to the book. But I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Alex Frank Thomaso for her dedication to the book. She was indeed the soul and the driving force behind the project. She was not deterred by any adversity and always pursued the goal with enormous energy, also in terms of deadlines. To put it simply, without her, the book would, as we already have heard, it would not exist, neither in the first nor in the second edition. I hope that my remarks have whetted your appetite to read the book, which you can browse through on our book table. In any case, I am delighted that you have shown an interest in our book by attending this presentation. Thank you all for your attention and for coming.